Okay, excellent.
Right, shall we begin? Welcome everyone this afternoon to this book launch and seminar with Montse Gomendio. And Montse, she is a research professor at the Spanish Research Council, and formerly she served as Spain's Secretary of State for Education, and she was also the OECD's Deputy Director for Education, as well as head of its Center for Skills. And I can add to this list of yours that you're also now a research professor here at UCL. And Montse, she will talk about her book, which has just been published, and the title of the book is Dire Straits: Education Reform, Ideology, Vested Interest, and Evidence together, that she wrote together with Lucy Vert. And I have read the book, and it's a fascinating insights into all the factors. Did I say all the factors? Some factors that either hinder or facilitate reform, casting light on the role of ideology, partisan politics, and stakeholder conflict of interests. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming here today and present your book for us.
Thank you for the invitation. Okay, well, thank you very much for all of you for coming on this really bad day. Sorry. Okay, so as Suzanne said, in the book, we cover a number of areas which we think are important in facilitating or hindering education reforms. We cover ideology, governance, conflicts of interest with stakeholders, and the impact of evidence, basically the impact from international surveys. So this is really broad, and in this talk, I'm going to concentrate on the impact of evidence. So why did we have such high expectations concerning the impact of comparative evidence, in the sense that we hoped that it would lead to improvements in education systems? Well, because this comparative evidence has the ability to identify good practices by comparing top and low performing education systems. It therefore can guide education policies implemented around the world by identifying which are the good practices that have led to improvements among top performing education systems. And therefore, they can also facilitate at the national level agreements overriding political divides and conflicts of interest. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on this one. You know, whether it's true that if you have really strong and solid evidence, that in itself is enough to override political divides and conflicts of interest. So I'm going to concentrate on PISA. This is the OECD survey of 15-year-olds, as I will show there are others. But the reason why I concentrate on PISA, besides of the fact that I've been working at the OECD and therefore know it better than other surveys, is that it's the only survey that, being part of the OECD, and because the OECD has the mission to provide policy advice to governments, defined as its mission to provide robust and solid evidence in order to improve the advice that the OECD was providing to governments, and therefore led to improvements in education systems. So in the last cycle of PISA, we didn't have one after 2018. It's a 3-year cycle because of COVID. PISA claims that it has become the world's premier yardstick for evaluating the quality, equity, and efficiency of school systems, and an influential form of education reform. I think that is correct. But it also says that it has helped policymakers lower the cost of political action by backing difficult decisions with evidence. Therefore, it assumes that when you provide solid evidence, then the political costs are minimized or disappear. And then it adds something which basically puts all the responsibility on governments, which is that because it assumes that it has made education reforms easier because of the evidence it provides. It claims that it has also raised the political cost of inaction by exposing areas where policy and practice are unsatisfactory. And therefore, what, translated, this is saying that governments are not listening to PISA. And why do we need to blame governments for anything? Well, I'll show you in the next slide, but basically these claims by PISA are based on two assumptions. The first one, that PISA policy recommendations are all sound. And the second one, which is the one I'm going to concentrate mainly on, is that PISA data is itself enough to reduce the political costs associated with implementing education reforms. And I'm going to argue that both are flawed to different extents. So as I said, there are other very influential international surveys that provide a lot of important evidence. I won't go into the details because I'm not going to be using their data here, but there are teams and pills. I just want to point out that the three surveys look at science, maths, and reading, but that there is a big difference in that teams and pearls look at students in the same grade, and they also look at curriculum content. So basically in each country, they can tell how much students have learned from that curriculum content. PISA doesn't look at the curriculum content. It claims that it looks at skills that are acquired, whether at school or at home or in the social environments, that are useful to solve problems in everyday life. So in a way, by using this definition, it seems more detached from what happens in schools, and still it's the surveys that places more emphasis on giving policy recommendations about policies that should be implemented in schools. And the other big difference, and you will understand later why I point this out, is that it doesn't look at students in the same grade. It looks at 15-year-olds, and that means that in countries where you have a high rate of grade repetition, not sure what I'm being told, sorry. Okay, whatever, don't worry. So it looks at 15-year-olds irrespective of the grade. So when you have a high rate of grade repetition, you have 15-year-olds in different grades, okay? Okay, so this is the PISA ranking from PISA 2015. I won't be using data from PISA 2018. They were withdrawn from Spain because they were deemed to be unreliable, and they were also withdrawn from other countries. So I think the most reliable cycle, the last more reliable cycle that we have from PISA is PISA 2015. So basically this is...
The maths is not included in the science, is it?
So this is just science.
Just science, it doesn't include maths, which often people include.
No.
Thank you.
But in every cycle,
Yes.
PISA has a main domain, which in 2015 was science, but it also has the two other domains, which are maths and reading. But if science says the main domain in 2015, it means that students spend more time doing the science test than doing the other two tests.
Sorry for the interruption, I just want to.
It's okay, thank you. So these are the top performers, and as you will see here and later, there is a clear advantage among countries in Eastern Europe, Singapore, Japan, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and there are also other top performing systems that are not in East Asia, such as Finland and Canada and so on. Now, if we go further down, then we go to the countries that are around the OECD average. And then here you have countries like Spain, which is just on the average. And then you go further down and down to the low performers. And then what happens is that because PISA has been including more and more countries, PISA started with around 30 countries in 2000. In 2018, and I think there were 80 participating countries. So the number of countries has grown larger and larger. And this is mainly due to the fact that it started by comparing OECD countries, and then low and middle income countries joined the survey. So what happens here is that you have 10 countries performing below this line. So basically what PISA shows, and I think this is very important, is that there are huge differences in the performance of 15-year-olds in science between countries, to the extent that according to the way PISA calculates this, the difference between Singapore, the top performer, and the lowest performing country, which in this cycle in science was the Dominican Republic, is equivalent to 7 years of schooling. That is a lot. That is almost the duration of compulsory education in some of these countries. So when people realized that the differences between countries were much, much larger than what people expected, then the expectation that a comparison between countries would lead to identifying good practices, peer learning, and the improvement of education systems was even greater, because the differences were huge. If the differences had been small, then there wasn't that much that countries would learn from each other, right? So this is just to say that when you compare, despite the differences that I mentioned, when you compare with just a correlation, PISA 2015 with TIMSS, which was carried out on the same year, then you find that the countries are ranked more or less in the same order. There are slight differences, but I'm not going to go into that. So you have a group of top performing countries in East Asia, led by Singapore. Then you have most European countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And then you have the low performing countries, which is mostly countries in Latin America, countries in the Middle East, and low middle income countries. So there are basically, at least in relation to the rankings, they are giving very similar information. So the conclusions from what we've seen so far is that, as I've explained, there are major differences in student performance between countries. So we would expect a lot of peer learning to be going on, and countries implementing the good practices that the top performers had implemented before. At the same time, while these surveys were carried out over the last 20 or so years, there have been increases in expenditure and many educational reforms. So there were lots of chances for countries to learn from other top performing countries. However, there have been no improvements in student performance in almost 2 decades, between the year 2000 and the year 2018. Definitely not among OECD countries, but also few countries have improved over this time frame. So why we have such huge differences? Why, if we have been able to identify those good practices, have countries not improved? And this is the graph that shows you that most countries haven't improved. So this is the average 3-year trend in science performance since 2006. PISA started in the year 2000. The reason why the comparison is done with 2006 is because this is the first cycle in which science was the main domain, going back to your question. So this is the right way to compare it, right? So you have most countries here in the middle, where if you compare the average 3-year trend in blue or in yellow, the change between 2012 and 2015, you can see that in most countries there has been no significant change. Then you can see a small group of countries that have improved. There are mostly low performing countries where it's easier to gain improvements, countries like Peru and Colombia and so on. And here we have an even smaller group of countries where the performance of students has declined. And there are some low performers, but there are also some top performers, particularly Finland, showing big losses here. So why are most countries stagnated and some even declining, even though we have this vast amount of evidence about good practices? So PISA's conclusion, as we've seen, is that the good practices have been correctly identified, but governments do not listen, basically. I mean, I'm just, trying to make the arguments very simple here. There are alternative hypotheses, of course. The one that interests me the most is that evidence cannot override intense conflicts of interest. That is naive to think that because you have strong evidence, that's going to override ideological divides, political bickering, strong conflicts of interest. They are of a different nature. Evidence has nothing to do with conflicts of interest when you're a policymaker and you're involved in this kind of negotiations. Therefore, the political costs remain very high, despite what PISA says. Then there's a different explanation for a set of variables, which is that most policy recommendations are strongly context dependent. And therefore, for policymakers, it's sometimes difficult to understand what is the precise situation of their country, and therefore, which is the right policy to implement in that context. And finally, there's another set of variables, mainly related to the issue of equity, where I think that the quantitative evidence is inconclusive, and then the policy recommendations are mostly based on qualitative information or ideological biases. And I will explain what I mean by that now. So basically, after analyzing all the evidence from PISA in great detail and the policy recommendations that are drawn from it, I am dividing the evidence on solid evidence, which is that, I will show now the evidence, but basically that the increases in investment have had no impact on improving student performance in most contexts, that there's another set of variables that are strongly context dependent, such as school autonomy and student assessments, and therefore it's difficult for policymakers to assess which policies they should implement. And finally, that in relation to equity, the evidence is very partial. The quantitative evidence is very partial or inconclusive, and therefore PISA is drawing more from qualitative information, and I will show the problems that I find with that. So what do I mean by no impact of investment? Well, this is a graph that PISA has shown cycle after cycle, so it's very robust, and any other analysis that I know of has shown a very similar result, which is, this is levels of investment, and this is student performance in science. So what you see is above a certain threshold, which is this one, there is no relationship whatsoever between levels of investment and student performance. And you can see that there are countries like Singapore and Japan that are performing above the levels of investment. Others are performing below, like Iceland or Israel. And you can see that there are countries like Luxembourg and Switzerland that are investing huge amounts and still not getting very good results in terms of student performance. And I won't go into detail here, but below this threshold, which is mainly low and middle income countries, you do have a strong relationship between investment and student performance. But I will concentrate on this section above the threshold. If you look at Spain, as I showed before, Spain in 2015 reached for the first time the OECD average, so it's very similar. But Spain has 17 regions. I don't expect you to look at all of them and understand, but the point that I want to make is you have each region followed by a blue line, which is the country that has the most similar score. So we have regions like Castilla y León that are similar to Hong Kong, or Madrid that are similar to Korea. So they are actually top performers. And you come all the way here and you have regions that are very low performers compared to other countries. So, well, this brings into question, what does the average mean? But that's another question, right? So you have huge regional disparities. And then when you look within a country, which obviously has the same rules for the education system and same culture, and you know, there are many, fewer confounding variables than when you compare. You're asking me a question?
Yes,
okay.
Is that possible?
Sure, yeah.
One discussion I'm sort of tangentially familiar is that the calculation of the PISA rank scores themselves being imputed as they are, based not only on the test scores that students achieve when you fill out these books, but partly as well due to family background factors that go into the calculation of these PISA scores. Do we know how this ranking would look if without consideration of sociodemographics in the calculation of PISA scores?
So The differences are huge. 90% of the variance is explained by the socioeconomic level in that particular region. And I will show later that family socioeconomic background has a huge impact. But here, when we're comparing regions, what you can do is compare the socioeconomic level of the region with a PISA score, and you get an almost perfect correlation. There are only two outliers, two above the line and two below the line. So socioeconomic level explains most of the variance.
That is even more interesting. If the university at PISA uses socio-demographic information in the calculation of the scores, for the PISA scores, is it then conceivable that all the variation we see in the PISA scores is up because the OECD said poor people are less good than in doing this?
Okay, can you wait just 10 minutes until I get to that section? Because otherwise it's a bit complicated, okay? But yeah, you're making a very good point. It's just that it takes a few slides to explain exactly what that means, okay? Okay, so we know there are huge variation within regions. We know that in Spain, all regions follow the same education system with the same rules, more or less similar culture and so on, so pure confounding variables. If you look at levels of investment, this is investment per student, this is the PISA score, then you see that there's absolutely no relationship between investment and student achievement. In fact, the Basque Country invests double of what most regions invest, and it has really low levels of student performance. So what does level of investment mean in education? So in education, between 80 and 90% of investment goes to teacher salaries. So basically, the variables that determine investment are two. On the one hand, the number of teachers, which is determined by the number of students in that country, but also very importantly by class size. The smaller the classes, the more teachers you need, and teacher salaries. So class size and teacher salaries basically determine how much investment in each country has, right? So if you look at teacher salaries and science performance, then again, you find no relationship. And if you look at class size and student performance, then again, you find no relationship. Basically, I mean, you can see that most countries are concentrated here, but basically what happens is that among countries with very large class sizes, and I'm talking between 40 and 50 students per class, while in Europe, the average is between 20 and 25, so we're talking double the number of students, you find the high top performers in East Asia, like Singapore and China and others, but also you find very low performing countries with very large class sizes. So no relationship whatsoever there. But so, you know, in the light of this really strong evidence, what have countries done? So you have in blue for each country here, in blue you have the change between 2012 and 2018 in the number of students. In many countries, the number of students has gone down because of demographic factors. Then in light green, you have total expenditure, almost always going up. And the variable which I find more relevant, which is total expenditure per student, because it's not the same to have a certain level of expenditure and to have a very large cohort of children or a very small cohort of children, right? So if you look at the dark green, then you can see that in most countries, total expenditure per student has increased. So this is, for me, the main example of a case where I do think that all the evidence provided by PISA and all international surveys is very solid, very robust. It clashes with the interest of many stakeholders, particularly teachers and the unions. Teachers' demands normally have to do with teacher salaries. Unions' demands normally have to do with class size, because the smaller the class, the more teachers you have, the more likely it is that teachers on shorter contracts will become civil servants and so on. So this is the main demand coming from unions in most countries. So when you're negotiating this kind of demands with these stakeholders, evidence really doesn't play any role. As you can see here, because you can see the changes between 2005 and 2019. Here you have the change in average class size, and here you have the change in teachers' salary. What you see is that most countries have continued to decrease class size, down here, down this line, and a few countries have continued to increase teacher salaries. So I have already explained, for unions, class size determines the number of teachers, the size of the membership, the power that they have. So for them, this is the main issue that they negotiate when there's an education reform. And they normally, and that was my experience definitely as policymaker, unions will make it very clear that unless you decrease class size first and second demand increase teacher salaries, they will not support the reform. Whatever the reform aims to do, it doesn't matter. They are used to getting those benefits from every reform, because if they don't support it, then obviously the political costs of undertaking the reform are very, very high. But also families tend to think, I mean, if you look at the schools around and what they advertise, the first thing they advertise is class size. And most families are convinced that class size does lead to more individualized teaching and is therefore of better quality. So this is an issue where we have very strong evidence, but major conflicts with unions. There is an assumption that levels of investment equal quality, and therefore, if any government dares to decrease levels of investment, then it is immediately interpreted as education not being a priority for that government. But this has very long-term implications. So as I said, the real top performing systems are in East Asia. And as I showed, in East Asia, they have very large class sizes. And the reason is that normally you have a trade-off between large class size and how much investment can go into training the teachers, into professional development, and so on. So these countries have made a decision to go for a large class size and to have a smaller teaching force of excellent quality. You go to the opposite extreme, Latin America, very low performing systems. The trend is to, and we've seen that some of them still have large class sizes, but the trend is to decrease class size. And then the problem is that you do have smaller class sizes, but you don't have investment to invest in training teachers, in professional development, and so on. And therefore, you have a very large teaching force of low quality. Part of the reason why this trade-off was possible in East Asia and not in Latin America is that the political costs in East Asia are very low. So in Singapore, or any of the other countries mentioned, you don't have strong unions that are able to make your reform impossible if you don't lower class size. Well, in Latin America, despite of the fact that teachers tend to be of low quality, the unions are incredibly strong, and therefore the pressure to continue to decrease class size is so strong that policymakers can only dare to try an education reform if part of the package is to decrease class size, because that's what the unions are demanding. Okay, so another set of variables is those that are strongly context dependent. And the problem here, as I said, is first, sometimes the policy recommendations are universal, and because they're strongly context dependent, in some countries they have a positive impact, but in some other countries they have a negative impact. And for policymakers in those countries that don't have good data systems and good metrics to evaluate the quality of the system, which is most countries in my view, then it's very difficult for them to assess where they are in that range, and therefore what kind of policy they should implement. So I will use here school autonomy as an example. Well, what is school autonomy? I won't go into detail here because we run the risk of getting lost. but it may have to do with the principal being able to make decisions about school resources or the curriculum or the time allocated to different subjects or student assessments, student admission policies, hiring of teachers. Surprisingly, this variable, which I think most people in other sectors would feel is the most important, being able to choose your team, is absent in most education systems. Teachers in public systems are, in most cases, not able to hire the teachers they want, and we can go into detail later if you want. Okay, so this doesn't come from PISA. This comes from analysis done by Hanushek and Wasman. And basically, this is the impact of school autonomy on PISA test scores. And this is GDP per capita. So basically what you find is that in those countries where the education system has already reached good levels of quality, giving autonomy to schools leads to good outcomes, as long as it goes hand in hand with accountability measures, in this case, exams. So you need two things. You need a good quality education system and you need accountability measures. If you don't have the two, then giving autonomy to principals and teachers who are not prepared and did not get the training to take responsibility for those new issues, then the consequences in terms of student performance will be negative. But although the evidence shows that it needs to be implemented with accountability mechanisms, that in low quality education systems, it has a negative impact, and that it's not a key element because in many top performing systems like Singapore and South Korea, they actually have low levels of school autonomy. PISA policy recommendations tend to be universal. So they tend to recommend greater school autonomy, irrespective of whether accountability mechanisms are in place. And in most countries, policymakers find it much easier to implement school autonomy than to implement accountability mechanisms. So often, school autonomy is implemented without the accountability mechanisms. This is perhaps the most widely implemented policy recommendations. As I said before, it's very difficult for policymakers to know. I mean, they know they need to implement accountability mechanisms. This may be politically very costly, but whether they have reached the level of quality required for that practice to have a positive impact on students may be difficult for them to assess. Okay, I think I explained all of that. And then the last bit that I'll discuss is variables that have to do with equity. This is a very complex issue, multidimensional, and it therefore can be measured in many different ways. And partly for this reason, I think the evidence is partial and inconclusive. But going back to your question before, now I'm going back to your question. Here you see score points in PISA according to the deciles. So of course, this is the bottom decile, this is the top decile in the population according to socioeconomic background, which is measured by PISA in a different way. It's not only socioeconomic background, it's number of books in the household and other things, but I won't go into that, right? And these are all the countries participating in PISA 2015. And as you can see, the impact of socioeconomic background on student performance is universal. There is not a single country that has been able to avoid the impact of socioeconomic background. However, there are countries where that impact is less than in other countries. There are more countries among those that perform badly where impact of socioeconomic background is not very strong. Why? Because if none of your students are performing well, then according to this variable, the system is equitable, but none of them is performing very well. So that's not what we should be looking for. What is more difficult is to be a top performer. So you have your students at this level of performance and still perform and still have a low impact of socioeconomic environment. And this is achieved in countries like Finland and Estonia. And I won't go into these two, Vietnam and Macau. We can discuss that later because I don't think that is reliable. Okay, now PISA does an analysis where it compares all the variables that you can look at. It's about, I can't remember now, and I don't have the figure here, but it's about 20 or 30 variables. Family socioeconomic background, by far, is the variable that has the greatest impact. So is this something that schools can do something about, or is this related to the fact that, for example, in the case of Finland and Estonia, as we all know, they're very equitable societies. And we do know that in more equitable societies, students are also more equitable in terms of their outcomes. So is it to do with something that the education system does, or is it a fact that in this country, the education system does not have the challenge to deal with inequality? It's two completely different ways of looking at the problem, right? Okay, so this is the impact, the variable that has the greatest impact. But because PISA claims that the lowest decile, the poorest students in Vietnam, do better than the richest students in Kosovo or Mexico, then there is no longer a divide between rich countries with good education systems and poor countries with bad education systems. But of course, the problem with that comparison is that poor students in Finland are not comparable to poor students in Colombia. So when we take that into account, what happens? And this is an analysis by Patel. This is not a PISA analysis. And this is comparing countries. In this case, it's the math score. And here you're taking into account two things. You're taking into account how rich the country is, but also annual household income. And then you see that, unfortunately, the world is still divided among rich countries where students perform better and poor countries where students perform worse. This is not PISA, right? This is not the PISA message. This is not the PISA conclusion or analysis. And also you find, and I don't have the time to show that figure, that in less egalitarian societies, annual household income has a much greater impact on student performance than in more egalitarian societies. Still, poor students in South Korea do perform better than rich students in Morocco, just to give two examples. So are quality and equity exclusive, or can they achieve simultaneously? Because a lot of people assume that there is a trade-off. I would say here you have countries that are above average in student performance and above average in equity in education. So it is possible, but not easy, because this is just a handful of countries when you compare it with the rest. So how does PISA measure equity? It does it by looking at many different variables. The three most widely used are impact of socioeconomic background on student performance, we've just seen, between and within school differences, and assuming that if between school differences are greater than within school differences, then that means that there's segregation between neighborhoods and more inequality and so on. The proportion of resilient students is basically the proportion of poor students that do achieve high levels of performance. There are others. These are the main three. The problem is when you use each of them separately, then each of them tells a different story. In certain contexts, it's wrong to use some of these variables. I will explain why. And also, major variables, in my view, to measure equity are missing. So basically, and this is really a summary, very, very simplified, but PISA policy recommendations in general recommend inclusive practices to avoid the so-called segregation. So it worries about ability grouping. It recommends delaying VET in all countries or any form of differential treatment. Here, it's where I think it places a lot of emphasis on qualitative evidence by using policy borrowing for Nordic countries, in particular, the narrative around Finland being a champion of equity. But countries, as we've showed, differ to a large extent in the levels of equity, which is very high in Nordic countries and was already high before PISA started, and it's low in others such as Latin American countries. Okay, so what concern do I have about Finland? So Finland is a top performer. Here you have the scores in reading, maths, and science. In blue, it's the OECD average. This is Finland. The surprise was in the first PISA cycle, which only had 30 countries, where Finland was the top performer, but only in reading, not in maths and science. It has never performed above East Asian countries in maths and science, and people tend to forget that. And why is this important? Because in Finland, parents put a lot of emphasis on teaching their children to read, and by the age they start compulsory education, most of the children read very well. So whether this has to do with school or home, it's difficult to disentangle. But most importantly for me, since 2000, when PISA started, all the scores have declined. And Finland has basically continued to implement these practices because everybody understands that this was the key to their success. So either there's something wrong with the interpretation or something has changed in Finland. And I would say it's a combination of the two, because since over time, over these years, immigration in Europe has been much, much greater. Therefore, Finland in the year 2000 was a very egalitarian, very uniform society. So the level population, sorry, the student population was very homogeneous. Over time, there's been waves of immigration. The population has become more heterogeneous. And by keeping those policies, Finland has continued to decline. So there's something that Finland should have been doing to remain a top performer, which hasn't done. And I think this is part of the reason why I think that policy borrowing from a very particular context, Finland, not just Finland, but Finland in 2000, may not be the right policy recommendation. But there are other things. This is a bit complicated, but I'll try to make it very simple. This is another survey. This is the survey of adults. It also comes from the OECD. It's PIAC. It tells you the levels of basic numeracy and literacy that adults have. And by adults, I mean from the age of 16 to the age of 64, right? You see huge differences between countries. Let me just say that above this line, PIAC, this survey, considers that the adults have enough skills to be functional. And below this line, the adults do not have enough skills. They're considered functionally illiterate, if you will, right? So if you look at Finland or Japan or the Netherlands up here, you have over 60% of the adult population that have a high level of skills. If you go down to Chile, Turkey, Spain, then you have over 60%, in some countries over 80% of the population, of the adult population, including 16-year-olds, this is just 1 year older than PISA students, that are illiterate according to these basic skills. So the point that I want to make here is that perhaps the policy recommendations that you give in a country where the adult population has very high, very uniform level of skills is not the same as you will give to countries with a completely different situation, with more than half of the population being functionally illiterate because of the low skills. And this is the same, we can't see it, but the other was literacy, and this is numeracy. Right, so let's see if this is really a problem. So if you look at PISA's questionnaire to principals, they ask them, what are the main obstacles to students learning? And there are many variables here. Poor teacher-student relations, teacher having to choose students of heterogeneous ability, teacher absenteeism, teachers being late, teachers not being well prepared, a whole range. If you look at countries with at the top range of adult skills, like Sweden and Denmark, between 40–45% of the teachers are concerned about teachers having to teach students of heterogeneous ability. But if you go to countries like Spain and Latin American countries, where most adults have really low levels of skills and you have a very heterogeneous student population, then up to 80% of the teachers think this is the main barrier to student learning, not just that they think it's important, they think it's the main barrier. So should you implement the same practices when this is not a problem than when this is the main problem? I think not. And unfortunately, Spain shows why not. Well, this is just, okay, so this is dividing PIAC data, as I said, from the age of 16 to the age of 65 into age cohorts. So we start with the oldest age cohort, 55 to 65. This is equivalent to what the education system was like 40 years ago. And we end with the youngest cohort to see whether things have improved or not, right? So you have Singapore, and it's amazing. It has a very difficult starting point. It continues to improve. It has become the top performer, and it seems to be improving cycle after cycle. You have Chile, worst starting point. It has improved, but not much. You have France, better starting point, not much improvement. Germany, the same. Lithuania, that's New Zealand, US, UK, no improvement. So what I'm saying is, I don't want to dwell into this that much because I know the UK government is really upset about this, but what I'm saying is you are going through this improvement of the education system. The practices that you implement when you're here are very different from those that you implement when you're here than those that you implement when you're here, right? And in Spain, that I'm going to be talking about today, is similar to Chile. So we have a difficult starting point, similar to Singapore, but we managed to improve only a little bit. So what happens when you implement policy recommendations from a country like Finland and you translate that to countries like Spain or Latin American countries? Well, it leads to high rates of great repetition, high rates of early school leaving, high rates of school unemployment. So I argue that these inclusive policies fail in countries which suffer not only higher economic inequalities, but also what I've shown, skill inequalities, because in these countries, the degree of student heterogeneity is much larger. And therefore, teachers need strategies that can deal with those differences between students in performance so that they can achieve learning gains. And these are the strategies that are considered to be non-inclusive and therefore not recommended. So what happens in Spain? So this is the PISA launch of PISA 2012. I'm using this because this is when I was Secretary of State, so it was my turn to present the bad results in Spain. So the headlines are always the same, cycle after cycle. The level of performance of students is very low. Spain repeats grade because we have a very high rate of grade repetition, but we shouldn't worry because the OECD says that we are high on equity. So the mantra in Spain is that because we have prioritized equity, then the trade-off is that we are not very good on quality, but this is justified because we prioritize equity. And I'm going to argue that's wrong. That's wrong because it's a lie, not because it's wrong to prioritize equity. So in terms of quality, we've been below the OECD average until PISA 2015, when we reached OECD levels, particularly bad in maths. PISA finds that within school variation is larger than between school differences, as I showed one of the variables that it takes into account. And from this single variable, it concludes that equity is very high in Spain. But the problem is that it's not taking into account that in Spain, 40% of students in the year 2000 were repeating grade. So they were 1 or 2 years below the model grade. So this is the reason why you have very large within school differences, because you have a lot of grade repetition within each school, which then explains much greater variance than between school differences. And the other reason why we're supposed to be high on equity is that the education system works in such a way that we have a really low proportion of excellent students. And because they all perform poorly, then this is supposed to be, I mean, this ranks high on equity. I'm just saying that's just not the kind of equity that we would want you want to level up, not to level down. So what is PISA and other international surveys not taking into account? So for me, the most important variable is early school leaving, which is strongly related to the high rate of grade repetition. So this is the average in the European Union. This is comparing 2002 and 2011. So you see that it's gone down from around 15% to around 8%. In Spain, it was 30%. It's gone down to around 25%. 1 in 4 students leave school without even getting the secondary degree, because they've been repeating grades for years before they leave school. Other countries also had a very bad starting point, like Portugal, but they've managed to decrease it. And the other countries in the European Union have much, much lower levels. So when you have 1 in 4 students leaving school after repeating grades for 2 or 3 years, I don't think it's right to conclude that this is an equitable system. So it's strange to me because grade repetition is the best proxy of early school leaving. If you have students that have repeated grades once, twice, or even 3 times, you know that that's the best signal that as soon as that student reaches the age of 16, which is the age at which compulsory education ends in Spain, they're going to leave school, no matter which grade they're studying. And this is exactly what happens. And if you compare our 17 regions again, this is the percentage of students in the model grade, so they haven't repeated any grades. And this is the percentage of early school leaving. Then the fewer students on the model grade, or the more students that repeat grades, the higher the rate of early school leaving, which in turn is related to youth unemployment, because these students leave with such low levels of skills that they are only able to get really low quality jobs in the construction sector, but the construction sector in Spain collapsed during the financial crisis, so that they have literally nowhere to go. So in a country like Spain, with 40% of students repeating grade at least once, which is the best proxy for early school leaving, where we've had 30% of early school leavers for decades that tend to become needs, that face high levels of youth unemployment. When I became Secretary of State, the level of youth unemployment was over 50%, really, really high. And major differences between regions in performance, rates of grade repetition, early school leaving, and so on. PISA conclusions are that grade repetition lowers student performance and is costly, but it doesn't identify the causal factors of grade repetition. To me, is obviously the consequence of such a heterogeneous population in the background, in the classroom, that there are students that start lagging further and further behind until they just can't understand anything and start repeating grades. I totally agree that grade repetition is not a solution, but then you need to implement solutions much earlier on in order to avoid that from happening. It's also based on the comparison of between and within school differences, which is used as a measure of equity. PISA concludes that one of the top performers in terms of equity fails to make the link with early school leaving, therefore missing a major source of inequity, and therefore I would argue that it's wrong in concluding that Spain is high on equity. In fact, during the reform that we implemented when I was in government, one of the things that we developed, contrary to OECD recommendations, was to modernize that, make it more attractive to students. And the enrollment in vocational education and training started shooting up after the year 2012 when the reform was approved, and in parallel, early school leaving decreased. So sometimes these policies that tend to be regarded as discriminatory, leading to equity, actually can be helpful to find some of the major sources of inequity. So I've already said this, I won't repeat it. Going back to the general picture, the three groups of variables that I have used, just to summarize. So I would argue that there is a set of very solid policy recommendations based on very robust evidence that have to do with the lack of impact of investment per se. Of course, it depends on how you use the investment, but if you use it to lower class size, which is what most governments do, then it has no impact, has had no impact whatsoever on what policymakers do, because there are major conflicts of interest. And the fact that this evidence exists does not minimize those conflicts of interest. It's pretty relevant, unfortunately, because I have tried to bring that evidence to the table and it has had no effect. Then there's another set of variables. I have used school autonomy and the fact that it needs to go hand in hand with student assessments as an example, which is may not have the expected outcomes when universal policy recommendations are made, because if they're applied in the wrong context, then they will lead to declines rather than improvements in student assessment. And because governments are basically left to decide on their own whether they are in the right context to implement those policies, then they may get it wrong, or it may be very difficult for a Minister of Education to say, sorry, I cannot grant more school autonomy because our teaching force is of really poor quality. That's something that no policymaker would want to say. And therefore, it's a very difficult decision to make. And then finally, I would argue that there's another set of variables, all of them having to do with equity, that is partial and inconclusive when you look at the quantitative data. So what PISA does is basically to use qualitative evidence, basically the legend of Finland being an education superpower and still today, and the top ranking country in terms of equity, to suggest policy borrowing from Finland to other countries that face radically different contexts. And as I think I have shown, this not only doesn't work, but it leads to very bad outcomes. And I'll leave it here, and just to say that because the publisher is Open Book Publishers from Cambridge, it can be downloaded for free, so you can get the PDF, and it would be great if you do that.